free lectures. But it's also, it's a very low investment for the tremendous return that the person gets for sponsoring Shiur.
Absolutely.
So it's a real bargain.
Jay, I put in for it. I told her every week, whatever. So.
Oh, who's that?
Thank you,
It's
David.
David Jarre.
David Jarre.
You're
Okay.
okay.
Thank you.
Thank you, David.
I told her if anybody else wanted to do it, they can do their name instead. So it's
Okay,
as long
so
as
that's
it's a
great. I
donation.
didn't receive the message, but I will make sure that you're on the list.
Cool.
well. It's thanks to Jay, because we spoke one day when I went to see my sister, and he said, you know, if you take $1 out every time you daven for tzedakah, it comes out to equivalency. So it's hit a bell, and it's true. So I just now give my contribution to the tzedakah for every davening every day.
Beautiful.
Thank you, David.
Beautiful, David.
Well,
Also,
thank you,
I
Jay,
think-
for giving me the, that insight into that.
Yes, I think Yale would also say you can have more than one sponsor.
You can definitely have more than one sponsor if you'd like. The shul is very happy to accept all sponsorships.
I'm not going to.
You're right. Thank you, Jay.
I'm not going to retract what I offered just because David is there first. I'll just go in second. Okay, so if we can start, Scott, we have Mazel Tovs. Mazel Tovs this week. We have Rabbi and Dr. Ivan Lerner and his wife on the birth of a great granddaughter.
Mazel tov.
Mazel tov.
Mazel tov.
Yoni Millman, son of Nancy and Pesach Millman, on the getting a PhD in electrical engineering at Princeton. All I can say to that is wow.
Yeah, mazel tov.
Being an electrical engineer, that is wow. Also, Marla and Marty Teichman on the birth of a great-granddaughter. And Vivian and Arnie Kirschenbaum on the marriage of their grandson. The other Mazel Tovs to announce this week? Okay, category 2 is Refuah Shleima. Please raise your hand. Rabbi Grauman will repeat the names.
Rav David Meir ben Chaya Sipa
David Meir ben Chaya Sipa
and Chaim Aiden Shalom ben Alta Brina.
Chaim Aiden Shalom ben Alta Brina.
Simcha Bonim.
Simcha Bonim.
Ben Leah.
Ben Leah.
David ben Shandel.
David ben Shandel.
Henoch ben Chana Rezel.
Sorry?
Henoch ben Chana Rezel.
Ben Chana Rezel.
Mordechai ben Shena.
Mordechai ben Shena.
Meir Leib ben Leah.
Meir Leib ben Leah.
Udo Bat Rachel.
Udal Bat Rachel. Welcome back, Stuart.
Thank you.
If we could intensify our praise for the refuah of Rabbi Hyatt. He did spend the past week in the hospital. He was taken there with some breathing problems. They think pneumonia. So he has been in the hospital. As of Friday, he was still there in Holy Cross.
All right. We should all have kavanas for strong refuah shalema.
Yeah, I talked with Mrs. Hyatt on Shabbos. They said that they used a ventilator on him and they tried to wean him off, but he was good for a couple of days, but then they went back on. So.
Sorry to hear that.
Tragic. Yeah.
Rabbi Fall, Yisrael Yaakov and Bela, Shoshana Tova Bas Esther, Chana Bas Devora. Chana Bas Leah.
Jonathan, did you have?
I think his microphone's
Okay, I have two names. Rave Binyamin Raphael Ben Reut.
What's the first name, Jay?
Rave, I'm like.
Okay, Rave.
Binyamin Raphael.
Binyamin Raphael.
Ben Reut.
Ben Reut.
This is the 8-year-old Israeli who's here in the country. They're trying to.
Yes, you mentioned last week.
And also my oldest son, Moshe Yosef Ben Rivka.
Moshe Yosef Ben
They broke his arm and wrist and everything falling off a bike. So
Right.
these are for Shlema.
For Shalema. For Shalema. For Chali Yisrael. Rabbanu Shalom Shetaka B'Shemer Matzil on all of us. It's a very delicate time, a difficult time in everybody's life. So
we have category 3. There are yard sites.
Yes, I have one. My father, Abraham ben Tzvi Halevi.
Avram ben Tzvi Halevi.
Yes, it's today.
Today. Neshama should have an aliyah. We should learn in the schus of his neshama.
Okay, I think I'm finished, Rabbi.
Okay, so we'll pick up where we left off. We're at the bottom of Yudam and Beis. We're finishing up the sugya in the machlokes between Rosh Lakish and Rabbi Yochanan on whether or not a minor, a katana, has a chotzer. Remember, we had the discussion about whether a chotzer can apply to a katana, and there's all kinds of questions because she's not in the category of majority where she can, where the psukim deal with her. So Rosh Lakish learns katana from shlichus, and Rabbi Yochanan, we said, learns it from yad, and we cited the various psukim, and as a result, through this whole machlokes, we understand that Rabbi Yochanan is the one who says that chotzer does apply, and essentially, according to Rosh Lakish, chotzer does not apply. That's in summary to what we said. So now, at the very bottom, 3 lines from the very bottom of the Amud, the Gemara is incredulous, and the Gemara says, "Umi iker lamanda omar chotzer lav mishum yada israbi." Can you really say that even Rosh Lakish doesn't hold that yad is that chotzer is because of yad? In other words, we kept saying, "Oh, it's because of shlichus, and therefore he doesn't have a shlichus, etc." The Gemara in wonderment says, "No, even Rosh Lakish has to agree. There's got to be a different reason for the machlokes between Rabbi Yochanan and Rosh Lakish, because Rosh Lakish has to agree that chotzer is mishum yad." So is it possible that he doesn't? V'hatanya, why? Because we learned in the Brisa, okay, the pasuk says yada ainli ele yada, gaga chatzera v'kefufa minayin. The same kasha we had earlier, for which we gave a different answer. So he comes and says in the pasuk that you give a get is, and the Gemara has a double lashon and says twice the word matzah. So the question is, yada ainli ele yada, gaga chatzera v'kafifa minayin. How do you know that the Torah says that if by the laws of kefil, by stealing, that if you take it by hand, you're chayav kefil. If it's on your roof or on your chotzer or your vineyard, your orchard, you're also chayav. Frek the Gemara minayin. How do you know? How do you know that you're chayav? From where do you learn that you're chayav? Talmud lomar v'nosan mikol makom. That it says v'nosan, and v'nosan means the pasuk says because of the sefer krisos v'nosan b'yada. V'nosan b'yada. So says Rashi, Talmud lomar v'nosan mikol makom. What does it mean mikol makom? Middle of kosavu v'yada yitnehu. The pasuk should have said because of lo sefer krisus ubiyada yitnehu, that he writes a get and he gives it to her hand. Ubiyada yitnehu, he gives it to her hand. Right? That would be the appropriate way of saying that yad, that hand, is what makes the kinyan. But it doesn't say that. It doesn't say biyada yitnehu. It says v'nosan biyada. So it says Rashi, midlo kosev b'yada yitnehu dorish v'nosan akosev lo v'nosan alma mishum yada isravi. The fact that it says v'nosan and he gave it before the word yad, that's where we extrapolate that the nosan, the giving, has to be like yad. The nosan b'yada, the giving has to be like a hand. And just as a hand is something that is attached to you, it is your rishus, it's you, so too the Gemara learns out a gag, a chetzeira, and a karfifa, meaning your possessions are like you. And that's how we learn that when you take a get and you throw it into the courtyard, or within the Dalet Amas of the woman, it's a valid get. But that's specifically by get, because it says v'nosan biyada. Okay, so then as Rashi finishes and says, the imishum shlichas have a kvar ksiva hacha gidatanya v'sholcha malama isha osa shliach. If you say it's because of shlichus, we see already that a woman, an adult, not a minor, an adult woman can make shlichus, but here we're talking about a minor. So it can't be because of shlichus. Shlichus applies only to an adult woman. But the idea of a kinyan that is similar to yad, v'nosan biyada, that can apply even to a kitana, to a young girl under the age of 12. And therefore, he's saying that even Rosh Lakish has to agree to that. But if Rosh Lakish agrees to that, what's the machlokes then between Rosh Lakish and Rabbi Yochanan? Why does Rosh Lakish say that chotzer is not koneh? He says Tana chotzer is not koneh, and Rabbi Yochanan says chotzer is koneh. If everybody's going to agree that you can accept the get, what's the machlokes? So it says the Gemara, le'inyan get kula alma lo pligi the chotzer mishum yada is rabbi. Legabe get, everybody agrees that chotzer is mishum yad, because it specifically says v'nosan biyada. So we can extrapolate v'nosan biyada that if he gives it into her hand and nosan has an enlarged understanding, that chotzer works. Ki pligi, what's now the machlokes if Rabbi Shlakish is going to agree that chotzer is mishum yada, ki pligi l'inyan mitzia, legabe a mitzia, legabe a lost object. Mar Savar, one man the Omer, top of Yud Aleph, Yalfina Mitzia Meget, Umar Savar lo Yaltzia Mitzia Meget. Who's the Mar? Says Rashi, Yalfina Mitzia Meget, like Rabbi Yochanan, Ki Hecha the Gabi Get Isle Chotzer, the Katana Gabi Mitzia Name Isle. That's Rabbi Yochanan. Therefore, Rabbi Yochanan says that a Katana can be acquired through a Chotzer, because even with a Mitzia, she can acquire, because Metzia is like get. It's the same. It's the same principle. But Rosh Lakish says, Umar Sava lo yalfinim, why? Mamona me'isura. So he makes a distinction between mammon, between a monetary transaction, u'me'isura, or an iser transaction. Get is an iser. What do we mean by iser? A get is what is not a monetary matter. It's a matter of halacha, of separating a woman from her husband to the exclusion of everybody else or not. So it's an Easter related thing, because if it's no get, then she's also to the world. If it is a get, then she's not also to the world. So according to Rish Lakish, there's a higher standard by Easter. Easter, we understand she is divorced because the pasuk says v'nosan biyada. But anything that isn't Easter, that I don't hold, says Rish Lakish. So that's the machlokes. According to this interpretation, the machlokes between Rabbi Yochanan and Rish Lakish has to do whether or not you can learn mammon, monetary, may Isser from Isser and Heter, from those laws. So Umar Savaloyo Fina Rish Lakish says Mamona Yisura, the Gabe Mamona Chotzer Mima Mimtze Israbe, Vikalamem the Shlichasu. So now he's now going further afield, and he's saying that legabe mammon, you can apply the principle of shlichus. So he goes off into another tangent, but basically Rish Lakish is saying that when he expounds the principle, which he does on Yudam and Beis, that Ketana ein lo chotzer ve'ein lo arba amos, that has to do with mammon, with monetary matters. But with Isser and Heter, of course, he agrees with Rabbi Yochanan that chotzer does have that a chotzer does you can throw it into the chotzer and it can work. So this is one interpretation of the machlokes between Rish Lakish and Rabbi Yochanan. The Gemara has several more before we complete. The ibois ema, another interpretation. B'ketana kola alma lo pligi alfina mitzia meget. No, really mitzia and get you can learn. When? By a katana, by a young girl. Since a young girl can accept the get by chotzer, we're not going to make a distinction between mitzia and get. V'hacha b'kotan kam miflagi. But we're really talking about a male, a kotan, not a katana. Mar Sava Yafin and Cotton Miktana, or Mar Sava Yafin and Cotton Miktana. The Gemara is really sort of trying to find different ways of explaining the machlokes between Rabbi Yochanan and Rish Lakish. So here, after first saying that the machlokes is simply whether or not you learn mammon from get, which makes sense, either you learn or you don't learn, he's saying no. Everybody says you learn mammon from get. Everybody agrees. The difference is that Rabbi Yochanan is speaking about a katana where you learn mammon from get, and therefore she can be kona both a get or a metzia. Rish Lakish, on the other hand, is speaking about a katan. He's speaking about a male, and there is no special dispensation for a male on chotzer. The only reason why we make a dispensation for a girl has to do with get, that if you throw a get into her dalet amos or into her chotzer, it should be valid. So once we already say that it works for get, let it already work for Metzia as well. Rish Lakish, on the other hand, says we're not even talking about a katana. We're talking about a katan. And if we're talking about a cotton, where does it say that by get, a cotton, there's no relevance. The whole relevance was by get. By get, there's no relevance to a cotton. Therefore, since get doesn't apply, Metzia doesn't apply. So he divides it differently, and he explains it that way.
So where does he get the expansion from get into mammon for a girl? I mean, it sounds like he's just stating it. We may as well do it.
Right, but
wouldn't he need some sort of proof of that or reference?
Well, again, you understand, in the Gemara, in the logic of the Gemara, when we're discussing get, which is the subject of this whole Gemara that we're discussing, the Chachamim, I mean the Tanoim and the Amoraim, of course, the Amoraim here are saying, you know what? This whole discussion is about get. Okay, what about a non-get? No, they don't need a source. They're just extrapolating. They're saying this is what the logic is. The whole discussion here is about get. What happens if we weren't talking about get? Is there a different halacha? Because we know that get has a very specialized halacha. Get is a very special document. It's not like any other document. Why? Well, first of all, because as Rashi explains, when you have a document that has to do with Isser and Heter, it's on a much higher, more sensitive level because you're talking about Isser Doraisa, a married woman who doesn't have a proper get and marries somebody else. It's an Isser Doraisa. So we have to be very careful and specialized when it comes to get. But how about a non-get? We write shtoros for so many other things, right? And we've seen it in other Gemaras that the Gemara makes distinctions between Isser and Heter and Mamonis. That's not a new concept. So he comes here and he says, you know what? Let's use that concept that by Isser and Heter, we have one stringent standard. But by Metzia, okay, it's a Metzia. So we don't have that same standard by Metzia. By Metzia, we do it differently. So therefore, Rabbi Yochanan says, no, you know what? If I'm going to learn it out, I'm going to learn it out with equivalency. Metzia is like get from the standpoint of a chotzer. Remember, we're not talking about the chotzer should be kona. The Isser and Heter issue didn't come in here. If chotzer is kona, it's kona, says Rabbi Yochanan. Why are you making distinctions? Rish Lakish, on the other hand, says, no. You can't compare Isser and Heter to anything else. Isser and Heter, I have to concede it because we're talking about something that is as stringent as that I have to concede. But on Mamonis, why should I concede with Mamonis? So the answer to your question is no, he doesn't need a pasuk or a source. It's a logical distinction the Gemara is making here. It's a logic. Isser and Heter is one thing, Mammon is another. You find that distinction elsewhere in Shas, not just here. So according to him, now, the second interpretation says, no, forget about that entirely. Even Rish Lakish agrees that we're not going to make a distinction between Mammon and Isser. We could, but we're not. The distinction now is between Katan and Katana. Why between Katan and Katana? Because the whole pasuk of Benasim B'yada has to do with get. Get has to do only with a female. And if we're talking about a Katana, I understand. But a Katan, where does he come into the parsha? A Katan has no special dispensation for get. First of all, he gives the get, and the get is not an Isser on him, but it's an Isser and Heter for the Katana. So therefore, he, instead of making the distinction horizontally, he makes it vertically. And he says, cotton here, katana here. For katana, we'll give her everything. Mammon is git. For a cotton, we won't give anything. That's this interpretation. We have yet another interpretation, says the Gemara. Dibois ema, mar machada, umar machada below pligi. So in other words, what the Gemara is saying is you can divide this machlokas many different ways. You can divide it between cotton and gadol, between cotton and katana. So every which way you look at it, there can be a distinction. Rashi says cotton pligi the Rabbi Bei Chotzer, because we find no place at all by a cotton where a chotzer is included. At least by katana, where even Rosh Lakish is agreeing that a chotzer is included in her ability to receive the get. Therefore, you can have a havamina that Metzia should apply, right? Because it's already a get. Okay, Metzia and the get, we can patch it up. But by a cotton, there's absolutely no connection whatsoever to chotzer. Where does it ever come? Therefore, we take the position that by a cotton, he can't use chotzer for anything, Metzia, anything. So again, what the Gemara is trying to show us here, the bottom line is that Rosh Lakish really has to agree that chotzer is mishum yad. That has nothing to do with shlichus, it has to do with yad, but there are other ways of dividing it into the machlokes. That's essentially how the Gemara concludes. Okay, now the segue to the next Mishnah is interesting because we started now talking about Metzia, right? We're back to Metzias. This is Bava Metzia after all. So now we're going to look at a circumstance a little bit differently about a Metzia. What does the Mishnah say? Okay, the previous Mishnah, when we were looking at the Mishnah, the last Mishnah that we were talking about someone who falls on a Metzia, whether there's Dalet Amos or not. So the Gemara is now, or a Chotzer, right? But has to do where he physically did something. He saw the Metzia and he fell on it. The Mishnah here is going to take it a step further. Ra osun rotzen acha Metzia. I have a nice large field, and I saw some people jump into my field, and I see them running. What are they doing? The word got out that there's a very fine gemstone sitting somewhere on my field, and people started running to the field to get the gemstone. So Ra osun rotzen acha Metzia. He saw people running in his field after a hefker, let's call it, or an object. Achatzvi shavur. They were running after a lame deer. Okay, we'll understand that in a minute. Achagozlo shelo pirchu. Running after birds whose wings were clipped and they cannot fly. Meaning, what is the point of all of these? The point of all of these are things, articles, or animals that are on his field that aren't going anywhere. A lame deer can't run. A flightless bird can't fly. A Metzia is inanimate. It's sitting on his in the ground. So what does he do? And he's standing there. V'ama zochsali sodai. My field is zocha for me. Right? It's his field. And he says, my field is zocha. Right? Okay, that's a step further from the last Mishnah. In the last Mishnah, he just jumped on it. The question was, does he have to say, not to say? Here, there's a field, and he says it. Zachsali sadeh. So the Mishnah, Zachsalo. It's zoche to him. He is zoche. The people who are running after the Metzia can't take it. They can't take the bird. They can't take the deer. It's his field, and he's zoche. Rashi, achatzvi shavur. A lame deer is like a Metzia, she'ena yochel lo rutz. It can't run. Umishtamer b'soch hasadeh, and it's just lying in the field. Im lo yitlu acherim. If someone else won't take it, it'll never leave the field. So if it never leaves the field, then supposedly we understand that the field can control it because it can't leave. And he says, Zoch sali sadeh, zoche. you're zocher. Okay. Now, in contradistinction, what happens if a deer who has all its capabilities runs through his field? Or birds who fly land on a limb of a tree on his field. Lo omar klum. He said nothing. Why? Because he doesn't control. The field doesn't control. If a bird happens to land on his bush or tree, what is he going to say? My field controls it. It's mine. It's not mine. The bird picks himself up and flies away. So, important distinction is that where something is in the field, which would remain in the field, but for the fact that someone might take it, then zochseli sadeh is okay. But something of which he has no control, it happens to be in his field, but could just as quickly not happen to be in his field, that means he has no control, he can't be zocher. So okay, that's the Mishnah. But l'chayra, there's a kasha on this Mishnah. What's the kasha? Yeah. We said in the previous Mishnah, remember, that the point came about, why does he have to say anything? If it's mishum chotzer, which is what this is, because it's his chotzer and he controls it, why does he have to say anything? The chotzer is kaineh. The minute it's in his chotzer, what happens if he doesn't say zochseli? Can someone come into his field and grab a lame deer or a metzia on his object? You can't come into my field and just take something. It's mine.
Right. That was I apologize. That was the question I was going to ask, but you just did, which is, why are strangers? The implication is if he doesn't say anything, a stranger can simply see a beautiful gem on your field, hop over your fence, grab it, and leave, and you can't say anything. But they don't have permission to come on your They don't have permission to come on your field in the first place, no matter what you say.
It's Geneva, right? It's
outright. Right. It's Geneva. Right.
Right. So I'm glad you thought about it, Yale, because the answer is he doesn't have to say. The answer is he doesn't have to say. But so the Mefarshim explain that the reason why it says he says it is because to keep it parallel to the second half of the Mishnah, which you see often, by the way, that the first half of the Mishnah and the second half of the Mishnah should be in sync. So he says Zachsali. Truthfully, he doesn't have to say Zachsali, his chotzer is Kona. You're 100% right. But he says Zachsali because the second half of the Mishnah, where you have the deer or running or the bird flying, he's there. If he said nothing, you wouldn't even think for a minute that he could be Kona. But if he said Zachsali, you might have a minute that is Kona because he said Zachsali, right?
So in terms of the field being Kona, does the owner even need to know that the gem is there? In other words, I'm in my house, I'm having my cup of coffee, and there's a beautiful stone, and people hop over the fence. I don't even know about it. They still can't come into my property and take it, whether I knew about it or not.
So hold that thought, because that's the Gemara's kasha.
Okay.
That's the Gemara's kasha. But to your point of speaking out, that's exactly what's going on here. You don't really have to say it. You're 100% right that the field is Kona. But he says it to parallel to the Seifa, where if a fine running deer, no blemish, no mum, runs through your field, you wouldn't have a havamina that you can control. But if you say Zachsali, there might be a flicker of doubt in your mind that maybe you're Zocha. The Mishnah comes to tell us you're not. You're not in any event, but if you said nothing, you surely wouldn't be. If you said something, maybe there's a half of 1% or a quarter of 1%, maybe he's Zocha. Says the Mishnah, let me disabuse you of that notion. You're not Zocha at all because you have no control over that animal or whatever it happens to be. Now, with the Metzia, it's different, of course, but something that's animate that can come in and out of your possession without any reservation, you can say from Hein Morgen, it doesn't matter. All right. So now that's the Mishnah. Okay, that's the Mishnah. So the answer is that you don't have to say anything to be Zocha for something that's on your field. But Yale has a good point and a good question. What happens if I don't know? I'm Rabbi Huda Shmuel. Rabbi Huda, in the name of Shmuel, tells us a big chiddush. What's the chiddush? That which the Mishnah said, that when you see a lame animal or a metzia on your field, v'hu she'omid mitzad sodeyu v'tiknele sodeyu. he has to be standing next to the field in order for the, he has to be standing next to the field. So l'chayra, the answer to your question, Yael, is he's got to be there. He has to be standing there. And if he's not standing there, it doesn't help. Frek the Gemara, v'tiknele sedeyu. What do you mean he has to stand there? Let the sadeh be kind of. Why? The Amar Rabbi Yossi bar Chanina, Rabbi Yossi says in the name of Chanina, Chatzer shalom konolo shalom medato, like you just said. A chatzer of a person, I can be sipping coffee on my patio. I don't have to be thinking about what's going on. And Rabbi Yossi bar Chanina says, my chatzer is kind of shalom medato. If a chatzer is kind of shalom medato, what about the principle that Rabbi Yehuda Shmuel says that you have to stand there? Why do you have to stand there? What's the point? Right? That's the kasha. So let's look at Rashi. I'm sorry, the Rashi is for later, but it's okay. It makes the same point. So in other words, we see a stira here. Rabbi Yehuda Shmuel says only if he's standing does it apply, and Rabbi Yossi bar Chanina says he can be in South Africa on a safari, and a deer, a lame deer, lands in his yard, and it's his, no question about it. So now the Gemara goes on, and the Gemara is going to give us an understanding of what the pshat is here. Hanamili, when does Rabbi Yossi bar Chanina say his theory, b'chotzer hamishtameres, by a chotzer that is mishtameres? Mishtameres means guarded. Typically, let's say it has a fence around it. A chotzer that has a fence is called a chotzer hamishtameres, and therefore, afilu shalom medato is koneh. Aber chotzer she'ena mishtameres, a chotzer that is not guarded, I omid b'tzad sadeyu in, lo. So if he's standing next to it, okay. If not, not. Now let's take a look at Rashi. I omed b'tzad sadeyu in, yes, the achshav he mishtameres al yado, because now it's as if it was mishtameres. In other words, if it doesn't have a fence and he's standing next to it, it's like it has a fence. And we're now limiting that which Rabbi Yossi bar Chanina says chotzer shel adam konelo shalom medato is only when it's mishtameres, when it has a guard meaning a fence. But if it doesn't have a fence and he's standing there, then he's the mishtameres, he's the guard. So that's the qualifying portion on this principle of shalom medato, that I omer mitzad sadeu in, ilo lo. Okay, so now no more machlokes, because we understand that when Rabbi Yehuda Shmuel says if he's standing next to it, he's assuming there is no fence, and therefore if it's a wide open field, now it still is a little hard to understand. Why? Because we're talking about your field. You own the field, it's yours. Where does someone have permission to come onto your field to take what's yours? But clearly, you see that there is a limiting factor here, that if a person's walking by and he sees a deer on the field, he can walk over to the deer, he can examine the deer cannot run, he picks up the deer and walks home. According to this Gemara, he can do that. It's not considered geneva, because it's an open field. Yes, it belongs to Reuven, or it belongs to someone, but it's still, the field itself can't be kaina unless there is some shmira, fence, a person standing. Okay, that's now the principle. Okay, it's a hard principle to understand. Frek the Gemara, umana, timra, the chatzashin mishtameres. How do I know this? You're telling me something that's a little hard to understand. I mean, it's not a logical principle. Jay, you asked the question before about how do you extrapolate between Metzia and Isser? Okay, so there's a certain logic that flows. What logic flows here that you own this piece of ground and I can come onto your ground and take something off your ground and not be chayv in Geneva? Where do you even come to that? That's what the kash is. Umenot timra. Where do you come to say the chotzer she'ena mishtameres I omid b'tzad tzadeo in ilo lo? So that's
Rabbi, is it safe to say that, you know, you could be driving past somebody's field, it's a huge field and maybe it's ways away from their residence or whatever, and they see a lame deer there, they might never know, you might never know that the deer was there or that it was lame, and so they could pick it up and move it because, you know, you're unaware. But if you're standing by the field, then obviously you are aware. Or if there's a fence, then the only way it got there is, you know, you put it there, or there was some,
somehow,
you know,
right.
there was some kind of owner. But if you just see a lame deer sitting in a field and there's nobody around and there's no residence or anything, why wouldn't you be able to pick it up? You would think that it's hefker, right?
Yeah,
right?
you would think so, but except for one thing. The edict that Rabbi Yossi Bar Chanina told us that a chotzer of a person is kona without his knowledge. In other words, since that principle exists, we have to come to qualify that principle only applies when there is a fence. Without our understanding that there's a qualifier, then what you just said would not be correct. Because if I'm riding along in this massive field and I see a deer sitting there, wait a minute, I can't touch that deer. This property I know belongs to Scott. I can't go onto his property, right? He could be sipping his coffee in somewhere else, and it's his. The teretz is that you're right, that unless there is something that guards the perimeter, a person, a fence, something, right? Even a scarecrow, I mean, whatever, something that l'chayra would be considered mishtameres, then that principle of mishtameres now comes into play here. Otherwise, why should I have the audacity to go into your field? You own this field. Where do I come to walk onto your field? Teretz is that there is a certain sort of, again, I don't know if it's a logic, but a certain sort of principle that if something is on the field and you see it, then now there are other prohibitions of going into someone's field to do things. We know, for instance, that if you're walking with your ox, you shouldn't have your ox eat from the tree or from the bushes that are on the side of the field, and a chanami. So you see that you don't necessarily need a fence to be. But there's a difference also between something that is mechubal karka, that belongs to the land and is part of the land. Then we make a distinction that land is yours. Something that isn't the land, it's something that is apart from the land but is on the property, we make a distinction between that as well. So those are different kinds of distinctions that the Gemara will make. But in any event,
it's kind of hard to understand how you could ever have the chutzpah to go into any field, because there's no free land anywhere in the United States.
Right.
It's owned by somebody.
Correct. But you see, yeah, right. Now, we're not talking lahalacha. We're talking in terms of the Gemara wants to sort of go through a logical process of how one looks at land and the difference between land and metaltalin. Keep in mind, what we're talking about here is not the land itself, right? We're talking about something on the land.
Metzia, yeah.
It's a movable object, a metzia on the land, a metaltalin. The laws of metaltalin are not the same as the laws of karka. So when you say, how could one have the audacity? The teretz says, wait a minute, let's not just go so extreme. You're talking about an object that may not have belonged to the owner. It wasn't the owner's. We're trying to say that mishum chotzer or mishum dalaramas, whatever, it should belong to him. So we're extrapolating a Talmudic principle to say that it should belong to him. I, on the other hand, say, wait a minute. This is a metzia. It fell from the sky. It was a bird. A bird's wing got clipped, right? It was hit by a stone. It fell to the ground. That bird could have flown over your land. You never would have seen it. The fact that it got hit over your land and fell, I should have a right to that bird just like you. Why don't I have a right to that bird? So this is the as I said, the pull and the tug. This is the machlekes here, since it's a metaltalin and not a mechubal karka, whether or not that metaltalin, it's not geneva. Why is it geneva? It's a metaltalin. It's something that you didn't have before, and you may not have later. So the logic is different. Look, it's hard maybe because we're thinking it's his land, but it's not his land that's being stolen or taken. It's something on the land.
So as Jay said, so is the reasonable man test here,
Right.
that since you cannot possibly know, since virtually all land is owned by some entity now,
Correct.
should be presumptive on your part where you're out hunting or whatever, and you see the gem, then unless you've gotten approval beforehand and you don't see it, it's not posted, you don't see a security camera, then you still have to assume that it is owned by someone, and therefore you can't just cop it and run.
That's the assumption.
Yeah.
That's the assumption, right?
Yeah.
But the Gemara wants to sort of create a logic or a thought process that maybe that's not the case. Again, not la halacha. We're not talking, maybe that's not the case, because remember, this is all, we're trying to interpret and think of things logically. Logically, you might say, well, this land is owned. It's on his land. It's owned by him. Of course it's his. I, on the other hand, will say, a minute ago, a bird was flying in the sky. Did he own it? No, he didn't own it. So by accident, it fell into his property. Does that mean his property is kaina? So then you'll say, yeah, because chotzer is kaina, right? Because there's a theory that chotzer is kaina. But wait a minute, chotzer is kaina. Okay, I understand chotzer is kaina, but is it kaina in this kind of circumstance where there was a pure happenstance and it was a metaltalin? Maybe not. Maybe not. In other words, right? If I threw that bird into your possession, there's a bird on the ground and I flipped it onto your ground, you could say, all right, somebody actually placed it there, the yad. In other words, again, you can look at all kinds of logistical differences. I put it there, I threw it there, but if it falls by itself, why should that be considered a chotzer kaina? That should be hefker to everybody else. Again, it's a thought process that we're in the middle of.
Right, so you have a bunch of kids playing stickball, and the ball falls into the person's chutzner.
Right.
Do they own does that guy own the ball? Right. No, get off my lawn.
We've all had that circumstance many times in our youth. And what do you mean? My ball happened to fall into your thing. It doesn't mean it's yours, right? Good point, Scott. That's a very good.
Today, you have times when parts of airplanes fall off the airplane.
Exactly right.
And it lands in a field. If you're seeing this piece of airplane flying, coming down into a field.
Is it now yours? Is it now yours?
That's the question. Why would it automatically be the field's owner?
If you say, right. So
it never belonged to the owner of the field. It just came out of the sky.
But then you're going to say chotzer is kaina. It's in my chotzer. It's kona. I didn't do anything, but chotzer mishloi medata kona. Now, again, you're touching on areas where halachically there may be a serious dispute, but you see the logic here. You see what we're talking about. All right.
Chanina a Tana or an Amora?
An Amora. He's an Amora. Yeah, Rabbi Yosef Rabbi Chanina is an Amora. Anyway, so now the Gemara is about to go and give us extensive raya from a sugya in Peah. It's a complicated sugya. So before going into that, because it really bears some understanding, and we may not get to it today, I want to turn to the Mishnah in Peah to explain what this is all about, so we'll understand the Gemara better. We all know that there is halacha. The Torah tells us leket, shikha, and peah. These are three different forms of loose harvest that an owner can't claim because it belongs to the aniyan. Okay, leket means that he's gathering and it falls down. Shikha means he forgets about a certain part of the field, and peah means the corner of the field. So those are all different types of, this is where an owner, I guess you could call this socialism or maybe distribution of wealth, is that the owner is commanded to give to the poor, and how he gives to the aniyim is that inevitably there will be leket, There will be shikha and there will be payah. You're commanded not to hoard those. Leave those for the adi. So we're going to focus for a minute now on shikha. What is shikha? Shikha means that you forget. What is it that you forget? Okay, so now it's a little complicated. So I'm going to read from the Mishnah and from the commentary of the Mishnah. It says in the Torah, Ki siksa ketzircha besodcha v'shorchachta omer basodeh. If you're harvesting in the field and you forget the gleanings in the field, lo soshuv lekachto, you should not return. Lo soshuv, you shouldn't return to take these stalks of wheat or corn or whatever it is. Lager liyosam lamana yihiyeh. It will be to the ger yosam almana. And the Torah goes on to say, L'man yivarecha Hashem alekecha b'chol ma'aseh yodecha, that Hashem will then bless all of your ma'aseh. This is the mitzvah of shikha. Now, I'm going to read from the Meforshim first. V'shoneh mitzvah zu mikol ha-mitzvah shebetorah. This is a unique mitzvah in the Torah from all the mitzvahs in the Torah. Shekol ha-mitzvahs, all the mitzvahs in the Torah ain't on a mekayim ela al yidei zechira. All the other mitzvahs in the Torah you fulfill through zechira, remembering. What does that mean? Kamosha Kosov. The Torah tells us in Bamidbar, in the Parsha of Tzitzis, the Torah says, "V'zachartem es kol mitzvos Hashem." You will remember all of the Taryag mitzvahs that Hashem gave you. Va'asisem osam. So zechira and asiya are connected. I, Rabbanu Shalom, give you and I tell you what the mitzvahs are, right? You have to know them and remember them. Va'asisem osam, and you have to do them. Okay? Every mitzvah of the Torah, except one. Which one? The mitzvah of shikha. The ilu mitzvah zu hi lehefech. This mitzvah is the exact opposite. Odom mekayim osa dafka alidei shikha. You only are mekayim this mitzvah if you forget. Yeah, the Torah says you have to fulfill the mitzvah of shikha. Torah tells us that. But when you're fulfilling the mitzvah of shikha, you're not saying you're not saying that as you would in theory for any other mitzvah. It's because you forgot to take it. That's why it's a mitzvah. And the Rabbi Shalom is mezaka you. It gives you a schar for this mitzvah. And it's brought down in the Tosefta. Here's the story. A person who had a field forgot the Omer. The Omer livno, and he says to his son, "Say v'hakav li olai par la'olo par l'shlamim." And he says to his son, "Go and prepare for me a cow for an ola and a cow for a shlamim." And those were karbanas, which we had learned previously in the Masechet Beitza, were for thanks to the Rabbanu Shalom. Omalo Abba Ma Ro'isa L'Smoach B'Simchas Mitzvah Zu Mikol Mitzvah Shebetorah. Why are you giving the Par La'ola Par L'Shlamim for this mitzvah rather than all the mitzvahs in the Torah? Omalo. So the father said to him, Kol Mitzvah Shebetorah Nosan Lanu Hamakom L'Datenu. All the mitzvahs in the Torah, the Baruch Shalom gave us to our knowledge. Zu Shalom L'Datenu. This mitzvah, the Baruch Shalom gave us not to our knowledge, meaning that we don't know, and therefore we're fulfilling it. Klomer. Shahashikha nasis me'aleha kinyan ha'aniyim. The shikha by itself makes a kinyan for the aniyim. V'ha'aniyim zochaba f'nei shenoda l'balasada sheshakach. And the aniyim thank the balasada that he forgot. All this is happening without him realizing it. He forgot. He wanted to harvest the whole field. Okay, he forgot. It wasn't a mistake. It wasn't intentional. He really wanted to harvest the whole field. He says, you know what? I'm going to give leket because I invariably will have stalks that will fall. I'm going to give payah. I'm not going to the corner of my field, but I want to harvest the rest of my field. Nothing wrong with that. There is nothing wrong with him saying, I want to harvest my whole field. It's his right, and it's his. But if he happens to forget, he can't go back. So somehow, the Rebbeinu Shalom made him forget, or he forgot, whatever. So by forgetting, the Aniyim are now thanking him that he forgot, and the mitzvah happened not because, like we say, de jure, rather de facto. It happened as a passive matter because he didn't collect it.
Is there a time scale to this mitzvah?
Say it again.
Is there a timeline for the forgetting?
The timeline is that when you enter your field to start the harvest, you now have to harvest.
Right.
If you start harvesting, and it's very interesting, the Mishnah will make an important distinction in a minute. If you go ahead and harvest, and you know what? You were so busy that there was a section of the field you totally forgot about because the field was so massive, and then you finished the rest of the field, you bypassed it, lo soshuv, you shouldn't return. Oh, wait a minute, the northeast corner, I forgot, there's beautiful corn there, I want to get that corn, but you already passed the northeast corner. Lo soshuv, you shouldn't return to go back to the northeast corner because that's considered shikha. Did you do it intentionally? Of course not. You wanted to harvest it, but you forgot it.
So you forgot it in a normal way of harvesting. It's not like it started to rain, you went home, you can't come back. You had
No. It has to be the normal way of harvesting, correct. If the rains came, the thunder came, you had to abandon, then no. But the minute you pass that portion, and then the rains came, the rain is no longer a teretz. In other words, it's really, again, let's just see in a minute how the Mishnah defines that. But what I'm saying is, lo soshuv, you shouldn't return. So if you pass that portion of the field, you should not return. Okay.
Yeah, there's a zechira. You have to remember the lo soshuv.
You have to remember the lo soshuv. Okay.
You have to remember zechira is lo soshuv.
So you want to say that the zechira is the mitzvah of lo soshuv.
Right.
Very good. Very good. Okay, so just let me finish the Tosefta. She'ilu lo haya b'rotzen l'fnei hamakom. If it wasn't because of the rotzen, the will of the Rebbeinu Shalom, lo bo mitzvah zuli yodenu, I would have remembered. If it wasn't that the Rebbeinu Shalom wanted me to be Mekayim in the mitzvah of shikha, I would have remembered. It's because of the rotzen of Hashem that I forgot. So therefore, it's not a zechira, it's a shikha. It answers your question. Okay. Alahari Omer. Right. Okay. So now, again, that's the Mefarshim explaining more or less what the mitzvah is and how the mitzvah. Okay. Now let's look at the mitzvah itself, because this is very important. What is the mitzvah of shikha? Okay. So let me explain. There's two components to the mitzvah. I have a big field. I am not going out to harvest the field myself. I'm the balabas. I can sit back, as Yael says, on my patio drinking coffee and don't have to worry about anything. I hire a bunch of harvesters, a bunch of workers. Those workers, my farm hands or hired third parties, they're the ones who go out into the field and they harvest. So let me ask you all a question. The mitzvah of shikha, who has to forget? What do you think? Who should be forgetting here?
People
what do you think?
Go into the field.
The poyalim, the workers are going out in the field. The balabas has no clue what they're doing. He's sipping coffee on his terrace. They're harvesting. They're going.
They're the ones who are forgetting to do the complete job.
So the poyalim are the ones who forgot the northeast corner and they're moving on. So now that if they move on, then you say that's shikha.
Well, it's shikha. Does it transfer back to the owner?
So that's the question. The question is, what's the logic here of who has to forget? Because you have two different entities here.
Well, if it was the owner, if it was the workers, the owner would never even know that it was forgotten. But if it was the owner and he's going back in and checking over the land, he knew it was forgotten because he sees it, but he wouldn't have known it otherwise.
But he
So,
wouldn't
so
have
what
been
do
able
you,
to.
so
No,
Scott, what
what
do you
gets
say?
back-
What are you saying? You're saying
I'm
what-
saying
what-
that it has to be the owner in my mind, it has to be the owner who forgets, not the workers, because the owner didn't forget, and the owner really wouldn't have known until he does the check.
So is this the same as culpability for a crime? If you have a hitman and you have the guy that sent the hitman?
Okay.
Yeah, but in a hitman, you're saying,
But
I
that's
want
like
you to
our-
do a
that's
certain
like our
thing.
Gemara. That's like our Gemara last week about a shliach who sends someone out to do the work. Except for the Dvar Avera, the shliach is the one who's chayiv. Rick, that's what you're saying. No, the shliach.
Yes.
The mitzvah has to be on the owner.
Mitzvah has to be the
Some
owner.
of them don't have to be even Jewish here.
Okay. Any other thoughts? Any other?
It's shlichus. It's shlichus, except there's no avera here unless somebody goes back and picks up the sheet that was forgotten.
Right.
That would be an avera. But if you just a question of shikha, then the workers are the shlichim for the owner.
So once the workers forget, it's forgotten.
Yeah. There's also a question of what instructions he gave them specifically. What did he tell them to do?
Okay, so we have different interpretations of what shikha is. We have a clear interpretation, it's the owner, and we have another clear interpretation. David said that it's the poyalim because they're the ones doing the work, right? Each one of those is a valid thought. What's the actual halacha? Says the Mishnah, ha'omer sheshakhu poalim, if the poalim were the ones who forgot, v'lo shechacho balabais, but the balabais didn't forget, or shechacho balabais, the balabais forgot, v'lo shechacho poalim, omdu aniyim b'fanov, or shetipish bikash, the aniyim are waiting to pounce, because they're all lined up to get the shikha. What is the halacha? Harezeh eino shikha. It is not shikha. In other words, you have to have both the owner and the poalim forget. In order for shikha to apply, they both have to forget. If one forgets and one doesn't, it's not shikha. So you would think that shikha should be the lowest common denominator because it's a mitzvah min Torah, and the Rebbeinu Shalom wants the aniyim to have it, right? That's logical. Rebbeinu Shalom wants them to have it. It's a big mitzvah, so go get it. Teretz, no. In order for it to be shikha, there has to be a meeting of the mind, so to speak, between the owner and the poalim. They both have to forget, and that's critical to our Gemara, which we'll have to pick up next week. But that's why we have to understand the halacha of shikha, even though it's such a big halacha, and you would think it should be de minimis, that the minimum would allow an ani to get shikha. Peya we're not worried about, because peya is peya. Leket is lekha. It's shikha, which requires, we'll say forgetfulness, but whose forgetfulness? Says the halacha, says the Mishnah, both have to forget. And if one doesn't forget and the other does, hari'ena shikha, and the aniyim cannot get it. I think that's a tremendous chiddush, because you're all right that shikha.
Two things.
One or the other should forget. Why should both have to forget? Yeah, nice.
All right, so two things. Number one is, I think in the previous, you were giving a lot of time, you said the northeast corner of the field. My understanding is that if you have literally the corner of the field, that's the deliberate leaving over pay.
I'm saying that's paya, right? But
right. Really, it should be, there's,
area. Yeah.
Right. There's some sections as they're going through the field that they miss.
In other words, you pass that portion of the field, and you're
right. Once you passed it, then it's shikha.
Right.
So number two is using the example, the polling versus the owner. So the problem then from the aniyim standpoint is they see the polling. Okay, fine. They know when the poll has been forgotten because they're now on to the next part of the field and they miss these little sections.
Correct.
Fine. How would they know whether the owner is planning on doing essentially a quality control check at the end of the day?
It's a good question. How would they know from a visual standpoint? I guess, and I don't know this. It'd be worth looking into what actually how it was done. Is that there may have been a system by which, again, maybe this was a gated farm. Let's just say, for argument's sake, it was a gated farm. And after the harvest, you had an Ehrlicher owner. And after he finished, he said, I'm now opening my gates to all of the Aniyim or Gerim or Yisoimim, whoever, because everything that's left in the field is now Leket, Shikha, and Peah. In other words, it wasn't a situation where, okay, the Poland moved on, now it's time to jump. That wasn't the case. The case, it may have been sort of organized chaos in that the Leket, Shikha, and Peah happened when the harvest was complete, not in the middle of the harvest. They're still harvesting. There's still a big field here. The Poland still have a lot of field to harvest. They just can't go back. So to your point, Menashe, it's not as how would they know? They would know because the Balabos is now saying, okay, everybody, it's yours. Go in, take whatever you want.
Right. So what about, though, I think, if I remember correctly, I'm not looking it up right now, Rus was following along right behind the Poland.
Rus was following behind the Poland.
I think.
I'd have to look at it. I don't recall. But the fact of the matter is that, again, that's not typically the way it's done. It's done that after the harvest, whatever is left on the field is Leket, Shikha, and Peah. And now he wanted to make sure she was among the first to get it. He Bedafka wanted her to have it. But that doesn't mean she was necessarily trailing the Polim, and as soon as they finished, they may have finished, and he said to Rus, you're first, so to speak. Again, we'll have to take a closer look at that. But typically, it's not just a free-for-all where, because, let's say they haven't gotten to the corners yet, then they can't go and preemptively take a corner before the harvest was completed. They have to wait until, and what gleanings? Yeah, the only thing that theoretically you can take is the leket, because if you've moved on, the leket is already what lying on the field after you moved on, because that's leket.
No, I think that's the answer. Yeah, it says vatelech vatavo v'telakate basadeh acharei kotzrim. So the leket, okay.
The leket you can take because the leket you already left on the field, that's for sure is leket. It's the shikha which you don't yet know. And again, there's will be a critical thing of lo soshuv. For instance, let's say the Polim have an interesting way of, you see this by people who mow grass. It's very interesting. Professional landscapers mow grass in an interesting way. Sometimes they mow it line by line. They go back and forth and back and forth and back and forth. Other times they cut an area. In other words, they're going horizontally. They don't go to the end of the field. They then turn and come back. They leave a line, which then, when they go perpendicular, they'll cut that line. In other words, right? When you come to a perpendicular point, it's not forgotten. They're going to come back around the other way and cut perpendicularly so that they will catch, but that was intentional. It wasn't only to go one direction, back and forth, back and forth. It was to go back, forth, and then to go north, south, north, south, north, south. In other words, so there was a method to what they were doing. That's not shikha. You can't say they forgot it because they didn't get to it yet. Remember, lo soshu, you can't return. But if you didn't get to it yet, the Aniyim can't say, oh, you didn't do that last line, that's ours. It's not yours, I didn't get to it yet. I've decided to get to it when I go the other way. So in other words, you have to think about that it's not so pashut, that shikha in every circumstance. If there's a method to the way they were cutting, then that method has to complete. And then you can say, oh, we forgot something behind us. And again, it says, well, soshuv, you shouldn't return. There's an emphasis on going back. But if you've never got to it, but you're going to cut it in a different pattern, that's not shikha. In any event, the bottom line here is that what's critical for our Gemara when we pick it up will be that it requires the Poalim and the owner both have to forget. And the Gemara is going to go through all kinds of interesting circumstances when the owner forgets, and when the owner remembers and forgets, remembers and forgets. So in other words, there's a whole complicated, it's not just simply he forgets. There's a forgetting and a remembering. That's how, and again, the Gemara wants to bring a raya. Remember, what's the whole point of that Gemara in Peah? The whole point of the Gemara in Peah, of the Mishnah in Peah, is to bring a proof to the point that you have to have guarded your field in order for the field to be kind of for you. If you don't have a fence or you're not standing there to guard the field, it can't be kind of. That's the whole point. And that's what this Mishnah in Peah, which we talked about now, next week, Mitzvah Shem, we'll apply those principles, and we'll see exactly how that works. But again, you see, the whole halacha of Peah it's not so simple. I mean, it's a big mitzvah, and again, shikha is a tremendous mitzvah because you don't remember, but it's a big mitzvah to give to the niyam, and you should do that. Of course, you should do that, but also you have to keep in balance the interests of the balabos, of the owner of the field, that it's his field, and the whole point actually of leket shikha and Peah, as Rashi and all the Meforshim tell us, is that you have to remember that the Rabbanu Shalom, and in Eretz Yisrael this is particularly apropos, because without the rains there is no economy, so you're really dependent on the Rabbanu Shalom and on his bounty and on his brachas. So when you as a farmer can make a bracha, oh, I have such a rich harvest and it's going to be a wonderful harvest, you have to remember the mitzvahs Hashem, and part of those mitzvahs Hashem are leket shikha and Peah. Remember, you're the apitropis. You don't own the land. It may be your land, but it's not your land. It's Rabbanu Shalom's land. So what you're doing is you're reaping from the bounty that Rabbanu Shalom is giving you, and God is saying to you, at the time that you are so happy that you bring karbonos and you bring bikurim and all these wonderful things on your behalf, remember there are people less fortunate, and they also have to reap from the bounty of the land. That's the way life works. So that's why leket shikha and Peah are such big mitzvahs. Okay, so something extraordinary we learned today in terms of the halachas of Peah, and Mitzvah Shem next week will. Now, next week will be our last, the following week is Rosh Hashanah on Sunday, right? And then the following week, we do have a shiur because it's Sunday, and then the following 2 weeks is Sukkot, right?
Do we have a shiur on Erev Yom Kippur?
Do we have a shiur? Erev Yom Kippur is...
Which is that Sunday.
Why not?
Sunday's Erev Yom Kippur, right. Yeah, well, why not, right? Let's have a shiur Erev Yom Kippur. Why not? We'll have a shiur Erev Yom Kippur, and then the following 2 weeks will be Sukkot, Mr. Shem. So
Richard has a question.
Rabbi Grauman?
Yeah.
Does Beis Din have industry standards to determine whether or not shikha applies?
So what do you mean by industry standards?
Like, here's how typically in our community farmers harvest their crop?
Oh, I see what you mean. No, there isn't industry standards. In other words, as long as what you're doing is consistent with a pattern. I mean, you may have people who cut zigzag and straight and curved and circular, who knows?
So it's determined farmer by farmer?
It's farmer by farmer. But to each farmer, there will be a pattern. And it's that pattern, whatever you do, follow what you do.
Well,
right.
If you do it circular and you go around and your blades missed a portion of the circular cutting, then to you, that's lo sashuv. You can't go back to that circular and do it again.
Well,
and Beis Din's not going to say, oh, this farmer's pattern or practice is unreasonable or inconsistent.
Yeah, look, the important thing here is that the farmer, again, he's a Jewish farmer, so he knows there's mitzvahs here. So he's not deliberately trying to take advantage of the aniyim and saying, I'm not going to do this. He wants to get, now, it's an interesting thing because I think there some of the Meforshim talk about what happens if there's a part of the field that was miyuchad, it was extraordinary, and you wanted to make sure that that part you cut for yourself. For some reason, maybe it was more fertile or it produced a certain type of product that was superior to everything else on the field. So there, you bedafke never had in mind to think. Now, that's where the discussion comes in between the forgetfulness of the workers and the forgetfulness of the owner, because the owner may know that that's a part of the field he absolutely doesn't want to give up. The Poland don't know the difference. They
Right.
cut, they cut. So if they're the ones who forgot, but the owner said, I'm not forgetting because I know that part of the field I have to have, then he doesn't lose his rights to it. If he forgets, another story. But he shouldn't lose his rights because after all, it is his work, his harvest, and everything else. So it's not one size fits all. It's not one size fits all. It's
Thank you.
your circumstance, but in your circumstance, you have shikha. Yeah.
There's two different issues. There's shikha and leket. With leket, I know there is something. I don't remember what the numbers are about how much grain or produce or whatever in one chunk counts as, a few scattered pieces, it's definitely shikha, but if you have a huge amount in one big pile, it's not.
Right.
I mean, leket, rather. And so the question,
right.
So the related question might be, though, for shikha, is there, aside from a designated portion, and aside from, of course, a corner, which would be presumed to be peah, if it's specifically a corner left over, which is no size on that, it could be a very big corner, but if there's a section in the middle, how do you know? In other words, maybe, you have an acre field. If you have a foot square, does that count? If you probably would it count as shikha. If you have 10-foot square, does that count as shikha, or is that maybe you filled up your machine and you would be, of course, going back to get more?
Well, yeah. So it's an interesting question.
I don't know.
Is there a maximum shear after which you say it's not really shikha because he didn't mean to do it? So the answer is that the shear doesn't matter. It's the way it was done. Clearly, a farmer knows what he's doing. He's experienced. So if he has in mind, look, I want to mekayim a mitzvah here. Or if he totally forgets and he says, I'm plowing. Oh, oops, I forgot. Too late. So all those things that you mentioned, he has to empty the machine because the machine is full. The weather got bad, so he has to stop. Those are all valid